Have you ever caught yourself giving everything to a relationship, only to realize you are the only one holding it together? It is an exhausting way to live, but what if this constant bending isn't a flaw, but a survival skill you learned as a child? Welcome back to Slow Down with Brenda. I am so glad you are here today. If you are sitting there feeling a little worn out from always being the one who stretches, accommodates, and fixes things, I want you to take a deep breath. Today, we are going to talk about where this pattern really begins and why it is so hard to stop. Let us start by asking a question that might land a little close to home. Why do so many of us keep trying so hard with people who never seem to meet us halfway? Why do we instinctively step up, fill the silence, smooth over the rough edges, and make excuses for someone else's lack of effort? For a lot of us, the answer starts much earlier than we would like to admit. Maybe you grew up in a home where love felt like it had conditions attached. They were never spoken out loud. Nobody wrote them down on a piece of paper or pinned them to the refrigerator. But you understood them all the same. You felt them in the air. The unwritten rules were simple. Be easy. Be quiet. Do not need too much. Do not make trouble. Notice what the room needs before anyone even has to ask you for it. Pay attention to the shift in someone's voice, the heavy footstep on the hallway floor, or the sudden quiet that meant storm clouds were gathering. And if you got good at that, really good at reading those subtle changes in emotional weather, things felt a little safer. The house felt a little calmer. And for a brief moment, it felt like you truly belonged because you had earned your peace for another day. I want to pause right here and say something very important to you. That was not a flaw in who you were. That was a child figuring out how to survive the only home they had. You did not choose your parents. You did not choose the atmosphere you were brought into. If the safest path through your childhood meant shaping yourself around someone else's unpredictable moods, then shaping yourself is exactly what you learned to do. You adapted. You survived. It was an intelligent, brilliant response from a child who simply wanted to be loved and kept safe. When we are small, our entire world depends on the adults around us. If they are stressed, distant, or overwhelmed, a child's mind does not think, "My parents are struggling with their own issues." A child's mind thinks, "If I am good enough, quiet enough, and helpful enough, everything will be okay." So we learn to put our own needs in a small box, push it under the bed, and focus entirely on keeping the peace around us. We learn to take up less physical and emotional space. We learn that having big emotions or asking for help makes us a burden. So we become the easy child, the peacemaker. And for a long time, that strategy worked. It protected you from conflict and earned you praise. But what we often do not realize is that the strategies that save us in childhood can quietly become the very things that exhaust us in adulthood. Here is the part that is a little harder to sit with. That survival skill you learned as a child does not retire just because you grew up and moved out. It does not stay behind in your childhood home where it first began. It comes with you, quietly and invisibly, into every relationship you build as an adult. Without even realizing it, you show up in your grown-up life already fluent in a very specific language, a language most people never had to learn. You know how to read emotional tension before it fully forms in a room. You know how to soften your tone to soothe someone else's bad mood before it turns into something worse. You know how to shrink yourself just enough, taking up a little less space, so someone else can have more of it. And if you look closely at your life right now, you might notice that this pattern does not stop with just one person. It shows up with romantic partners who expect you to do all the emotional heavy lifting. It shows up with friends who take and take, but rarely ask how you are doing. Sometimes, it even shows up with your own children or your coworkers. The exact same quiet calculation runs in the background of your mind. What does this person need from me right now, and how quickly can I hand it over so everything stays peaceful? There is a helpful concept that psychologists sometimes use to explain this phenomenon. They call it the accommodation muscle. And just like any physical muscle in your body, This emotional muscle grows stronger through daily repetition. Every single time you adjusted your plans, silenced your own feelings, or swallowed your truth just so someone else could stay comfortable, that accommodation muscle got a little stronger. By the time you reach adulthood, that muscle is often so well developed and so automatic that using it does not even feel like a conscious choice anymore. It simply feels like who you are. You tell yourself, I am just an empathetic person, or I just prefer to go with the flow. But here is the problem with an accommodation muscle. A muscle like that does not know the difference between someone who has actually earned your flexibility and someone who is simply taking advantage of it. It does not evaluate whether the other person is treating you with equal respect. It just does its job. It bends and flexes every single time it is called upon without ever checking whether bending is actually the right or healthy response anymore. When you live with an overdeveloped accommodation muscle, your nervous system remains in a state of quiet vigilance. You are constantly scanning your environment, measuring the emotional temperature of the people around you, and anticipating their needs before they even voice them. It is like living with your hands constantly resting on the wheel of someone else's emotional state, trying to keep them on the road so you do not crash together. This constant hyper-awareness is profoundly draining. You might find yourself sitting on the couch at the end of a long day, feeling completely depleted, even if you did not do much physical work. That exhaustion is real. It comes from carrying the weight of everyone else's emotional comfort while neglecting your own basic needs for rest, honesty, and genuine connection. We often mistake this constant bending for love or kindness, but deep down, it is usually driven by a quiet fear. The fear that if we stop accommodating, if we finally say no, or if we show up as our full, unfiltered selves, the relationship will fall apart. We worry that people only love the version of us that makes their lives easier. Recognizing this mechanism is not meant to make you feel ashamed. It is simply about bringing light into a corner of your life that has been in the dark for a long time. Once you see how hard your accommodation muscle has been working to keep you safe, you can begin to ask whether that level of bending is still serving you today. When we start noticing how much we bend for others, it is very common to feel a wave of frustration with ourselves. We look at our relationships and ask, why do I keep ending up in situations where I am doing all the work? Why am I drawn to people who demand so much and give back so little? I want us to be very gentle with ourselves right here. It is not because you are weak. It is not because you have bad taste in people, and it is definitely not because some part of you secretly wants to suffer. The truth is much simpler and far more compassionate. Bending is simply the primary tool you were given for staying close to someone. When accommodating is the only language of love and connection you were taught as a child, reaching for something new feels terrifying, even if the old way is wearing you out. To your nervous system, what is familiar feels safe, even when what is familiar is exhausting. Strain that you know how to manage will almost always feel less threatening than the unknown territory of setting a boundary. When you think about saying no or asking for what you need, your body might react as if you are stepping off a cliff. Your heart rate quickens, your stomach tightens, and a quiet voice whispers that you are being selfish, difficult, or ungrateful. That reaction is not proof that you are doing something wrong. It is simply your old survival mechanism trying to protect you from the risk of rejection. This is why so many of us stay trapped in one-sided dynamics for years. We keep hoping that if we just give a little more, explain a little better, or become a little more patient, the other person will finally notice our effort and meet us halfway. But an unbalanced relationship rarely fixes itself through more self-sacrifice. In fact, the more you bend, the more room the other person has to stay comfortable without ever having to change. So instead of asking yourself, what is wrong with me for letting this happen? I want to invite you to sit with a much quieter, gentler question. Ask yourself, where did I learn to do this? And do I still need this pattern the way I used to? When you shift from self-criticism to quiet curiosity, something remarkable happens. You stop fighting with yourself. You begin to realize that your tendency to over-accommodate was actually a creative, protective response from a younger version of you who had very few options. That younger self deserves your gratitude, not your judgment. You do not need to fix everything overnight. You do not need to tear down your relationships or demand immediate changes from everyone around you. Healing this pattern does not start with a grand confrontation. It starts internally, with the simple act of noticing. Just seeing this pattern clearly as it happens, without rushing to judge yourself and without frantically trying to fix it, is already a massive shift. It means you are stepping out of automatic pilot. You are standing at the doorway of a new way of living, where your own needs finally get a seat at the table. As we bring this conversation together, I want you to remember one essential truth. You are not that same helpless child anymore, trying to earn safety one small compromise at a time. Back then, shrinking yourself was your only option. You depended on the adults around you for food, shelter, and belonging. But today, as an adult, your safety no longer rests on someone else's approval. You have your own voice, you have your own choices, and you get to decide how much of yourself you give away. Learning to let your accommodation muscle rest is a practice, not a destination. It does not mean you suddenly become cold, distant, or uncaring. It simply means you stop setting yourself on fire to keep everyone else warm. It means recognizing that you can still be a kind, loving person while honoring your own limits. So, how do we actually begin to shift this deep-seated pattern in our everyday lives? We do it by starting very small. We do not need big speeches or sudden, drastic changes. We only need one tiny, manageable step. Here is a small action you can try tomorrow. The next time someone asks you for something, whether it is a favor, an opinion, or an immediate decision, give yourself a pause. Instead of letting your accommodation muscle give an automatic yes, simply say, "Let me check my schedule and get back to you," or "Let me think about that for a moment." That simple pause creates a small pocket of space between their request and your response. In that quiet space, you can ask yourself one honest question. Do I actually have the capacity for this right now, or am I just trying to keep them comfortable? If you realize you do not have the energy, it is completely okay to say a gentle no. You do not need to provide a long explanation or a list of excuses. A simple, polite, "I would love to help, but I cannot take that on right now," is enough. The first few times you do this, your chest might feel a little tight. That nervous reaction is completely normal. It is just your body adjusting to a new way of protecting your energy. Sit through that brief moment of discomfort, knowing that you are building a new muscle, the muscle of self-respect. You were never meant to carry the emotional comfort of every person in your life. That weight was never yours to hold. You are allowed to take up space. You are allowed to have boundaries, and you are allowed to be loved for who you are, not just for what you can do for others. Thank you so much for spending this quiet time with me today. Take it easy on yourself tonight, take a slow breath, and remember that stepping into a peaceful life starts with one small step at a time. I will see you in the next video.